He told me the foundation was collapsing, that one wrong step could bring the whole east wing down on top of me, that the contractor said the support beams were rotted clean through, and the gas line underneath was old enough to kill us both if it cracked. For 6 years, I believed him. For 6 years, I never once turned the handle of that iron basement door, not because I was afraid of the house falling down, but because I trusted my husband more than I trusted my own eyes. Then one night in October, after he fell asleep on the couch with a glass of bourbon sweating a ring into the coffee table, I slid 2 fingers under his belt, lifted the small brass key from the ring he never let out of his sight, and walked down those stone steps into a room that had nothing to do with a collapsing foundation and everything to do with the second life my husband had been living underneath our home. My name is Odette Marchand Kessler, and before I tell you what I found behind that iron door, you need to understand the house it was hiding inside of, because the house was never really his to begin with. Marchand House sits at the end of a gravel lane in Hollow Ridge, Vermont, a town so small it does not have a single stoplight, just a general store, a white clapboard church, and rows of maple trees that turn the whole valley into fire every October. The house had belonged to my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it with lumber cut from our own land, and my grandmother used to tell me that every room in that house had a story older than the country's newest states. When my mother passed and left it to me, I was 29 years old and terrified of the responsibility. But I promised her, standing at her graveside in the rain, that I would never let it fall into anyone else's hands the way so many old family houses do, sold off in pieces to strangers who tear out the moldings and put in granite countertops that mean nothing to anyone. I met Desmond Kessler 2 years after my mother died, at a restoration conference in Burlington where he was giving a talk about sustainable renovation practices for historic properties. He was tall in a way that made rooms feel smaller, with dark hair he kept combed back and a voice that made every sentence sound like a decision that had already been made. He complimented the pin I was wearing, my grandmother's brooch, and told me he could tell just by looking at it that it had been hand-set. He was right. I was flattered before I even knew his name. Within a year, we were married in the garden behind Marchand House, under the same oak tree where my parents had married 30 years before. And for a while, I believed I had found a man who understood that some things are worth more than money because they carry the weight of the people who came before you. Desmond ran a construction and renovation company called Kessler Restorations, and in the early years of our marriage, business was slow enough that he was grateful for the connections my family name still carried in that part of Vermont. Old families with old barns and old churches wanted a contractor who understood what they had, not one who wanted to modernize everything into something unrecognizable. I introduced him to people. I vouched for him at historical society meetings. I let him use photographs of Marchand House in his marketing materials, the wraparound porch, the hand-carved staircase, the leaded glass windows that caught the afternoon light like something out of a painting. Within 4 years, Kessler Restorations had grown from a 2-truck operation into a company with 30 employees and contracts across 3 counties, and everyone in Hollow Ridge said Desmond was the best thing that had ever happened to that old house, as if the house had been waiting for him instead of me. It was around that same time that he started talking about the basement. Marchand House had always had a basement, a long stone cellar my grandmother used for canning vegetables and storing apple cider, cool and dry and smelling faintly of dust and old wood. I used to play down there as a child, hiding among the shelves during games of hide and seek with my cousins. But 6 years into our marriage, Desmond came to me one evening with a folder full of papers and a face arranged into careful concern, and told me the eastern foundation wall was cracking from water damage, that the whole support structure beneath the kitchen was compromised, and that until it could be properly repaired, nobody should go down there. He said it the way he said everything, calm, certain, already decided. I remember asking whether we should call someone from the Historical Society, since the house was technically registered, and he said he had already handled it, that his own crew would fix it quietly so we would not have to deal with permits and inspectors treating our home like a museum exhibit. I believed him because I had no reason not to. He was after all the expert. His whole career was built on knowing which walls could bear weight and which ones would crumble if you breathed on them wrong. Within a week, He had installed a heavy iron door at the top of the basement stairs, replacing the old wooden one that had swung freely my entire childhood, and he kept the only key on a small ring clipped to his belt, right next to his truck keys, where it stayed for the next 6 years. At first, I did not think much of it. Marriages are built on divisions of labor, and construction had always been his domain, not mine. I focused on my own work, restoring textiles and historical documents for museums across New England, work that let me spend long hours in the sunroom with magnifying lenses and archival gloves, piecing together the fragile evidence of other people's pasts while somehow missing the evidence unfolding in my own basement. Every few months, I would ask him how the repairs were going, and every few months he would give me an update laced with just enough technical language to sound convincing and just enough vagueness to discourage further questions. The beams needed curing time. The concrete needed to settle. The insurance adjuster wanted another inspection before signing off. 6 years is a long time to believe a foundation is still being repaired, but grief and love and trust have a way of making people patient with the people they chose to build a life with. What I did notice, slowly, in the way you notice a stain spreading across a ceiling long before you understand there is a leak in the roof above it, were the small absences. Desmond began working later, sometimes not coming home until close to midnight, always with a reasonable explanation: a client emergency, a supply delivery that ran late, a crew member who needed him on site. He started keeping his phone face down on every surface he touched. He began showering the moment he walked through the door, even on nights he claimed to have spent entirely at his desk doing paperwork. And once, only once, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a crib, a full-sized nursery crib from a baby furniture store 2 towns over. And when I asked him about it, he laughed and said it was a gift for one of his foremen whose wife was expecting. And I laughed too, because the alternative was not something my mind was prepared to hold. The night everything changed started like any other. It was the 2nd week of October, the maples outside blazing orange against a gray sky, and Desmond had come home early for once, which should have been a small mercy, but instead felt like the beginning of something I could not name. He poured himself a bourbon after dinner, then another, and by 9 o'clock he was asleep on the living room couch with his shoes still on, one arm draped over his eyes, breathing the heavy, even breath of a man who had nothing left to hide because he believed himself untouchable. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching him sleep, watching the small brass key catch the lamplight where it hung from his belt, and something inside me that had been quiet and obedient for 6 years finally, quietly, refused to stay that way any longer. I did not plan it the way people plan things in movies. There was no elaborate scheme, no gloves, no flashlight tucked into a coat pocket days in advance. I simply walked across the room in my socks, knelt beside the couch, and with hands that were shaking more than I expected, worked the small brass key free from the ring without waking him. He stirred once, murmured something unintelligible, and rolled onto his side, and I stood there frozen for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 seconds, waiting to see if he would open his eyes and ask me what I thought I was doing. He did not. His breathing settled back into its heavy rhythm, and I closed my fingers around the key and walked toward the kitchen, toward the iron door at the top of the basement stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door was cold under my palm, colder than a Vermont October night should have made it, as if the metal itself had absorbed 6 years of secrets and refused to let any warmth escape. I slid the key into the lock, and it turned with a smoothness that surprised me, no rust, no resistance, the mechanism of a door that had been opened far more often than a man claiming structural danger would ever admit to. The hinges did not creak. They had been oiled, recently and carefully, by someone who did not want to be heard. I stepped onto the top stair and reached for the light switch I remembered from childhood, and when the bulb flickered on, I stood there for a long moment simply unable to process what I was looking at, because it was not a basement with cracked concrete and rotted support beams. It was not dangerous at all. It was a home. Someone had drywalled and painted the entire space in soft, warm colors, sage green in what had clearly become a small sitting area, pale yellow in a room that could only be described as a nursery. There was carpet, plush and clean, laid over what had once been bare stone floor. There was a small kitchenette against the far wall, a coffee maker, a mini refrigerator humming quietly, dishes stacked neatly in a drying rack beside the sink as though someone had washed them only hours earlier. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with novels and parenting guides and a row of photographs in matching frames, and it was those photographs that made my knees give out and forced me to sit down hard on the bottom stair. Because in every single one of them was my husband, smiling in a way I had not seen him smile at me in years, his arm around a woman I did not recognize, and in several of the more recent photographs, a small boy who could not have been older than 4. With Desmond's same dark hair and the same decisive set to his jaw. I do not know how long I sat on that step. Long enough for my legs to go numb, long enough for the shock to curdle into something colder and more useful. I made myself stand and walk through the rest of the space, because I needed to understand the full shape of what I had found before I let myself feel anything about it. There was a bedroom, tastefully furnished, with a woman's clothing hanging in an open closet, sizes and styles I did not recognize as mine because they were not mine. There was a small desk with mail addressed to a Priscilla Vance, some of it forwarded from an address in Montpelier, some of it addressed directly here to a street number that did not exist anywhere in Hollow Ridge because this address, as far as the outside world was concerned, did not exist at all. There was a child's room with a crib, the same crib from the receipt I had once laughed away, and a small dresser covered in stickers, and a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon plugged into the wall beside a rocking chair that showed the soft wear of years of use. I found a calendar taped inside a kitchen cabinet, the kind of small detail a woman keeps for herself rather than for show, and on it were notes in unfamiliar handwriting. Desmond here Tuesday. Desmond here Friday through Sunday. Desmond missed dinner, said Odette needed him for something with the museum people. My own name, written by a stranger's hand, folded into a calendar tracking my husband's visits to a secret family living beneath my own house. I do not have adequate words for what that particular sentence did to me, seeing myself referenced as an obstacle, an inconvenience, a scheduling conflict in someone else's love story. I found financial documents, too, tucked into a drawer beneath the calendar, and this was the moment the shock finally sharpened into something with edges. There were bank statements for an account I had never seen, deposits arriving with regularity from Kessler Restorations, the company I had helped Desmond build with my family's name and my family's connections. There were receipts for the renovation of this very basement, tens of thousands of dollars labeled in the company's own books as structural repair and foundation stabilization. The same lie he had told me for 6 years, except it was not only a lie he had told me, it was a lie he had told the bank, the insurance company, and apparently, based on one particularly damning invoice, the county assessor's office as well. He had not simply hidden an affair beneath my house. He had funded an entire second household, using money drawn from a business built on my family's reputation, filed under fraudulent renovation claims that likely qualified for historic preservation tax credits meant to protect houses like mine, not to bankroll a mistress's rent. I climbed back up those stairs on legs that did not feel entirely my own, locked the iron door behind me, and returned the small brass key to Desmond's belt with hands that had somehow stopped shaking. Because somewhere in that basement, standing among a stranger's family photographs, I had crossed over from devastation into something colder and infinitely more dangerous to him, which was clarity. I did not wake him. I did not scream or cry or throw the bourbon glass against the wall the way some other version of myself might have. Instead, I walked upstairs to what had been our bedroom for 6 years, sat down at the small writing desk by the window, and began making a list, the way my mother had taught me to make lists whenever life became too large to hold in my head all at once. I wrote down every detail I could remember from the basement. The name Priscilla Vance. The approximate age of the child. The dates on the calendar. The account numbers on the bank statements, memorized quickly and imperfectly, but memorized nonetheless. By the time the sun came up over the maple trees outside my window, I had not slept a single minute, but I had a plan, and more importantly, I had the beginning of proof. The next morning, Desmond woke with the particular sluggishness of a man who had drunk too much bourbon and slept too little, completely unaware that his wife had spent the night quietly dismantling 6 years of his careful architecture of lies. He kissed my forehead on his way to the coffee maker, told me he loved me, said something about a client meeting in Montpelier that would keep him out late, and I smiled and told him to drive safe. And it was the easiest lie I had ever told in my life, because for the first time in our marriage, I understood exactly what he meant when he said Montpelier. I did not confront him that day. I have thought many times since about why I made that choice, and the truth is that I did not trust myself yet to face him without falling apart, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of watching me break in real time the way he had, apparently, been watching me not notice for years. Instead, I called Beatrice Aldridge, who had been my mother's closest friend and was now, in her retirement, one of the sharpest attorneys in the state of Vermont. A woman who had handled my family's estate matters for 2 decades and who I trusted with the same unshakable certainty I had once misplaced on my husband. Beatrice arrived at Marchand House within the hour, sat across from me at the kitchen table, and listened without interrupting as I described everything I had found: the nursery, the woman's name, the child, the financial documents. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, and then she said the words that would define everything that came after. "Odette," she said, "this is no longer just a marriage falling apart. This is fraud, and if even half of what you are describing involves company funds and falsified tax credits, this is a matter for the state as much as it is a matter for divorce court." Over the following week, Beatrice helped me quietly gather what evidence I could without alerting Desmond, who continued his routine of late nights and weekend absences with the same casual confidence he had maintained for 6 years. Apparently never once suspecting that the wife he had trained to stay out of his business affairs had spent her nights photographing bank statements with her phone and cataloging the contents of a basement he still believed was locked to her. Beatrice connected me with a forensic accountant named Pharaoh Whitcomb, a meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses who had spent his career untangling exactly the kind of financial deception Desmond had constructed. And within days, Pharaoh confirmed what I had already suspected in my gut. Kessler Restorations had been filing renovation claims on Marchand House for 6 consecutive years, each one describing extensive structural repairs to a foundation that, according to the historic preservation records Pharaoh pulled from the county office, had never once failed an inspection because no inspection had ever actually taken place. The company had claimed historic preservation tax credits meant to protect properties like mine, credits worth tens of thousands of dollars, and funneled that money, along with regular company draws logged as equipment and materials, into an account that funded an apartment in Montpelier under Priscilla Vance's name, and more damningly, the entire secret renovation of my own basement into a home for a family that was not mine. The child, Pharaoh's research eventually confirmed through public records, was named Julian, and he was 3 years old, which meant Desmond had begun this second life within the first year of our marriage, back when he was still calling me his whole world in front of guests at our wedding reception. Back when he was still charming Historical Society board members with stories about how much he respected the legacy of Marchand House. 3 years old meant this was not a recent mistake born of loneliness or a marriage gone stale. It meant he had been living 2 entire lives from nearly the beginning, one upstairs with me, curated and comfortable, and one below my own floorboards, warm and yellow-walled and stocked with a crib he had laughed off as a gift for a foreman. I will not pretend the discovery of Julian did not complicate something inside me, because it did. My anger at Desmond was pure and uncomplicated, sharpened daily by every new document Pharaoh uncovered, but my feelings about a 3-year-old boy who had done nothing except exist as a consequence of his father's choices were harder to sort through. I did not hate that child. I could not. But I understood, with the same clarity that had carried me through that entire terrible week, that my responsibility was not to manage the feelings of everyone touched by Desmond's deception. My responsibility was to protect what remained of my family's legacy and to make sure the truth, all of it, finally came out from under that iron door. 2 weeks after I first turned that small brass key, Beatrice and I met with Pharaoh one final time to review the complete financial picture before deciding how to proceed, and it was in that meeting, surrounded by neat stacks of bank statements and county filings, that I made the decision that would end everything. I would not simply divorce Desmond quietly, the way some part of me, the tired, grieving part, might have preferred. I would file for divorce, yes, but I would also formally report the fraudulent tax credit claims to the state, and I would remove Desmond from any authority over Marchand House immediately, revoking the limited power of attorney I had granted him years earlier for handling contractor logistics, the same authority he had apparently used to falsify claims against my own property without my knowledge or signature. That evening, I called a locksmith from 2 towns over, a discreet man named Holloway who had done work for my family before and understood the meaning of quiet, and had every lock in Marchand House changed, while Desmond was still in Montpelier believing he had another full evening ahead of him with the woman and child living beneath a house that no longer legally recognized his right to enter it. I packed a single bag of his clothing and left it on the front porch, along with a manila envelope containing copies, not originals, of everything Pharaoh had found. I did not want him destroying evidence, but I wanted him to understand, immediately and completely, exactly how much I already knew. He arrived at 11 that night, and I watched from the upstairs window as he tried his key in the front door, once, twice, a third time with growing violence, before finally seeing the bag and the envelope sitting on the porch swing where I had left them. He read through the papers by the light of his phone, and even from that distance, through glass and darkness, I watched his shoulders drop the way a man's shoulders drop when he finally understands that the version of events he has been controlling for years has slipped entirely out of his hands. He pounded on the door. He called my name, softly at first and then with more desperation, the same way another woman's husband had once stood on a porch in a story I had read online months earlier and thought, at the time, could never happen to someone like me. I did not open the door. I sat on the top step of the staircase in the dark and listened to him beg, and felt something inside myself finally go quiet after weeks of screaming silently into empty rooms. He called 43 times that night. I know the number exactly because I counted, the way I had once counted stitches in an 18th century sampler I was restoring, methodical and detached, using the counting to keep myself from feeling anything too large to manage. Around 1 in the morning, the calls stopped, and I assumed, correctly, that he had finally understood no answer was coming. The following morning, Beatrice filed the divorce petition on my behalf, citing irreconcilable differences alongside a detailed accounting of marital fraud, and simultaneously submitted a formal complaint to the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation regarding the falsified tax credit claims filed against Marchand House. Within 72 hours, the state opened its own inquiry, separate from my divorce proceedings entirely, because falsifying claims to a state preservation fund is not a private matter between a husband and wife. It is a crime against the public trust, and once that inquiry began, it moved with a momentum entirely outside my control, which was, in its own strange way, a relief. I no longer had to be the only person carrying the weight of exposing him. The truth had developed its own gravity. Desmond tried, of course, to reach me through every channel available to him. He sent flowers with no card attached, which I left to wilt on the porch, until Beatrice suggested, gently, that I stop giving the mail carrier a reason to gossip. He tried showing up at the restoration studio I worked out of in town, and I had my assistant, a quiet, capable young woman named Guinevere, inform him that I had no further comment and that any communication needed to go through counsel. He even tried reaching my elderly aunt, my mother's younger sister, hoping she might soften me on his behalf. But my aunt, who had never fully trusted him even at our wedding, told him in no uncertain terms that she had buried better men than him and would happily do it again if it meant protecting her sister's legacy. 3 weeks into the investigation, Pharaoh uncovered something even more damaging than the tax fraud, though by that point I had begun to expect that every layer I peeled back would reveal another beneath it. Kessler Restorations, it turned out, had been quietly overbilling several other historic property owners in the county, using nearly identical language to what he had used against me, structural damage requiring extensive and expensive claims that inflated the company's tax credit eligibility while the actual work performed was minimal or, in 2 documented cases, entirely fabricated. I was not the only wife who had trusted a husband's expertise over her own instincts. I was not even the only client. Desmond had built an entire business model on exploiting exactly the kind of quiet, trusting relationship people in small towns extend to a contractor who understands the value of what they are protecting. And I had simply been the closest one to home. When this second layer of fraud came to light, the state investigation expanded significantly, and two other property owners, an elderly widow named Cordelia Prout, who owned a colonial farmhouse 2 miles from mine, and a young couple restoring a former schoolhouse on the edge of town, came forward once they learned they were not alone in having trusted Desmond's assessments. Cordelia, in particular, had a story that made my chest ache in a way I had not expected, because she described almost the exact same pattern. A section of her home Desmond had convinced her was too dangerous to use, locked away under the guise of protection. Money quietly funneled out under false renovation claims, while she, in her 70s and living alone, had simply trusted the nice young man who had once helped her grandson with a school project on historic architecture. The criminal case moved slowly, the way these things do, through the county prosecutor's office and eventually a grand jury. But by early spring, Desmond Kessler was formally charged with multiple counts of tax fraud, falsification of business records, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult in Cordelia's case specifically. Charges that carried the very real possibility of prison time and would, regardless of the ultimate sentence, permanently strip him of his contractor's license across the state. Kessler Restorations, the company built partly on my family's name and reputation, collapsed within months, its remaining employees scattering to other firms, its trucks sold at auction, its sign taken down from the office building on Main Street and never replaced. Priscilla Vance, I learned through the proceedings, had known nothing about the fraudulent financing of her apartment or the falsified claims against my basement, a fact I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, relieved to confirm. She had believed, much like Amanda Blake in that other story I had read months before all of this happened, that Desmond was separated from a wife who wanted nothing to do with him, that the arrangement beneath what she understood to be simply a rented property was a temporary situation while their own future together sorted itself out. She reached out to me once, through Beatrice, asking not for forgiveness but simply for the chance to explain herself, and I agreed to a single phone call, brief and careful, in which she told me, voice shaking, that she had found the crib receipt suspicious herself once, years ago, and had asked Desmond directly why it had my name attached to the delivery address, and he had told her it was simply easier to have things shipped to a business address for tax purposes. Even his lies to her had been built on exploiting me. I told her I did not blame her for believing a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of being believed, and I meant it, though I also told her, gently, that I hoped she would find her own way toward independence for Julian's sake, away from a man who had proven, across at least 2 households and 3 separate victims, that his promises meant nothing at all. The divorce was finalized in late spring. Nearly 7 months after the night, I slid that small brass key free from Desmond's belt. Because of the prenuptial agreement my mother had insisted on before the wedding, an agreement Desmond had once joked about, calling it old-fashioned and unnecessary, Marchand House and everything within it remained entirely mine, untouched by the settlement, protected exactly the way my mother had intended when she made me promise never to let it fall into anyone else's hands. The fraud proceedings ensured that whatever remained of Kessler Restorations' assets went first toward restitution for Cordelia Prout and the young couple at the schoolhouse before anything else was settled. And I did not fight for a single dollar of it, because I did not need his money. I needed my house back, whole and honest, with nothing hidden beneath its floors. I hired a new contractor that summer, a woman named Thessaly Ackheffer who ran her own restoration firm out of Burlington, and who, upon hearing the full story from Beatrice, drove out to Hollow Ridge personally to inspect the basement before agreeing to take on the project. She confirmed what I had begun to suspect on my own, that the original foundation, beneath all of Desmond's drywall and paint and careful staging, was in remarkably good condition, exact. Lie as it had been for over a century, needing nothing more than the routine maintenance any old stone foundation requires. There had never been any danger at all. There had only ever been a lie, dressed up in enough technical language to keep a trusting wife from ever picking up a hammer and checking for herself. I asked Thessaly to tear out everything Desmond had built down there, the sage green walls, the pale yellow nursery, the plush carpet laid over stone that had breathed freely for generations before being smothered under someone else's secret. I stood at the top of the stairs and watched her crew haul out drywall and carpet, and the small crescent moon nightlight I could not bring myself to look at directly. And when the space had been stripped back down to bare stone and old wood, I asked her instead to restore it the way it had been in my grandmother's time: shelves for canning jars, a long wooden table, the smell of cool earth and old timber that had nothing to hide because it had never needed to. That October, exactly 1 year after I first found that room, I stood in the finished basement of Marchand House, surrounded by the smell of fresh cider my aunt had helped me press from apples off our own trees, and felt something settle inside my chest that I can only describe as the particular piece of a house finally telling the truth about itself again. I did not throw a party or make any grand announcement. I simply sat on the bottom stair, the same one I had collapsed onto the night everything changed, and allowed myself, for the first time since that October evening a year before, to cry, not out of grief for Desmond, whose absence I had stopped mourning months earlier, but out of something closer to gratitude, for a mother who had insisted on a prenuptial agreement I once found almost insulting, for a friend who became a lawyer exactly when I needed one most, for my own hands, which had been steady enough on that terrible night to turn a small brass key without waking the man sleeping only feet away. Desmond was ultimately sentenced to 18 months, later reduced on appeal to a combination of home confinement and an extended probationary period, along with a permanent revocation of his contractor's license in the state of Vermont, and a restitution order that would take him years, possibly decades, to fully satisfy given how little remained of Kessler restorations by the time the courts finished dividing its assets among his victims. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. Beatrice told me the outcome afterward over coffee at the general store in town, and I remember feeling, strangely, very little at all, as though the news arrived for someone I used to know rather than the man I had once married under an oak tree with my whole family watching. Cordelia Prout and I became, unexpectedly, close friends over the following year, bonded by an experience neither of us would have wished on anyone, but that neither of us could fully share with people who had not lived through it. We began meeting for tea every other week, and she told me once, stirring honey into her cup with the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned not to trust easily anymore, that the hardest part had not been losing the money, which her children had eventually helped her recover much of through the restitution order, but losing the version of herself that had once believed a friendly smile and a confident voice were reasons enough to trust someone completely. I told her I understood exactly what she meant, and I did, more than I could have imagined understanding a year earlier. Priscilla Vance moved to a small town in New Hampshire the following spring, taking Julian with her, and sent me, unprompted, a short letter that spring explaining she had enrolled in a nursing program and was building a life entirely separate from Desmond, who she said had reached out to her exactly twice since his sentencing and been ignored both times. I do not know if Julian will ever fully understand the circumstances of his early childhood, the basement, the secrecy, the fraud that funded his nursery, but I hope, for his sake, that his mother's decision to walk away from that entire chapter means he grows up somewhere honest, even if that honesty came at the cost of everything Priscilla had once believed about the man she loved. As for me, I kept Marchand House exactly as my mother intended it to be kept, whole and honest and entirely my own, and I threw myself back into the restoration work that had always been the truest part of my life, the careful, patient work of taking something damaged and returning it to what it was always meant to be. I still think, sometimes, about that night, about the weight of the small brass key in my palm, about the particular silence of a house holding its breath while its owner finally learned the truth it had been keeping from her for 6 years. People ask me sometimes whether I regret not confronting Desmond immediately, screaming at him the moment I climbed back up those stairs instead of quietly building a case for 7 long weeks, and my answer is always the same. Rage that moves too quickly burns itself out before it can build anything lasting. The kind of justice that actually changes something requires patience and evidence and the willingness to let the truth speak for itself instead of drowning it out with your own understandable fury. Some nights I still walk down into that basement just to stand there, surrounded by canning shelves and the smell of old wood, and remind myself that some rooms deserve to stay exactly what they claim to be. Marchand House does not hide anything from me anymore, and neither, I have promised myself, will any home I build for the rest of my life. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done the moment you found that key still warm from his belt? Would you have confronted him immediately, or would you have done what I did, and let the silence build into something he could never talk his way out of? Share your perspective in the comments below, and if you enjoy stories about betrayal, hidden truths, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim what is yours, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.